individual growth mindset. Before I introduce you to tonight's panel, we'd like to get to know you. We want to get to know who's in the audience today. What we're going to do is put up some questions via Mentimeter and Slido to gather your thoughts. So you can see right in front of you, the details are on the screen. There's a QR code you can scan to use your phone. And there should be a link going into the chat as well. We're just going to ask you a real couple of simple questions, and we want to get your feedback so it helps shape tonight's discussion. First, as you can see in front of you, pick 3 words to describe what you're hoping to get out of today's session. This will help our speakers a little as we come to our discussion through the in-conversation. So 3 words that would really describe what you want to get out of tonight. I'll just give you a minute or so to link into Slido and to submit a few answers to the question. Okay, so we see we've got 1, 2 people that have come in so far. I think knowledge is a good one. Okay, we've had a few responses there. I think things coming through immediately is knowledge, inspiration, ideas. I think that's been a real running theme throughout the event series. And I think tonight, where we're talking about sort of growth mindsets, it's a much more personally applicable thing. So hopefully getting some knowledge and understanding of growth mindsets will be particularly useful to everyone. If we move over to the second question. So what type of museum do you work in? If you could just quickly let us know what type of museum you work in. And the Ideas Museum, that's excellent. This will help us kind of understand who is in the room tonight, hopefully shape some of our answers a little. Yeah, independence, big one. It's something, again, we see a lot of with the London Museums Group. It's a great network for independent museums where you don't necessarily have the opportunity to go off sort of training every day like you would in maybe a large national with a big budget. Okay, independent small museums, that's a very useful steer for us tonight. And if we just flick over to the last question, is there any topic you'd like to see covered in future LMG events? So this isn't so much about tonight, but it will help shape our future program when we come out from this final session is the next one. And as we start planning for our next series, what kind of things do you want us to cover? What would be useful? Okay, funding, skills, leadership, career development, excellent. Work with funding generators is always a very, very, very important thing. I think everyone needs that right now, funding and funding skills. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that. Keep throwing them in there, and we'll be able to grab those as the session moves on, and we will now move on, of course. So thank you very much for that. I will now introduce you to tonight's speakers. We've got Zorica Patel, or Dr. Zorica Patel, I should say, from the University of Westminster, and Steve Gardam from the Roald Dahl Museum. So I'd like them each to give a quick sort of 2-minute introduction to themselves and their organisations. Shall we start with Steve?
Good evening, everybody. Yes, I'm Steve. I've been director of the Roald Dahl Museum and Story Centre, to give it its full current title, since February 2015. This past year has been my second experience of closure. We had a big flood closure in 2018, so it's not the same as a global pandemic, but it's not the first time that the normal run of things has had a bit of a disruption for us. Before that, I worked at London Transport Museum, helped establish their young people's programme as head of museum learning, and then previously I was head of corporate education programmes at the Imperial War Museum. I worked at the Postal Museum before it had its site with Mail Rail open, and I started my career at London Metropolitan Archives, the largest county record office in the country, for those of you that don't know it. The Roald Dahl Museum and Story Centre is based in Great Missenden, which is a lovely village in the Chiltern Hills in Buckinghamshire, about 30 miles outside of London. It's about 50 minutes on a train from Marylebone. It's really nice feeling the city fall away from you as you head out into the countryside, for you Londoners who want a bit more green in your lives when we're allowed to travel a bit more freely. And it was also voted one of the top 100 places to walk in the country recently. And it's true, there are so many walking trails across and around the Chilterns. It's a really lovely place to explore. The museum is independent. We're an independent charitable trust, and we were founded as such. We're also quite a young organisation. We opened our doors in 2005. The museum is physically very small. We're in a period of buildings with a bit of new build at the end. And before all of this nonsense started, we were getting, on average, about 60,000 general visitors a year. And on top of that, 12,000 students came to take part in a facilitated session in our schools program. So I think that'll do for now, but obviously happy to answer any more questions as they come up.
Fantastic, thank you, Steve. And Zori, would you be able to give a little introduction to yourself, please?
Yes, I'm very pleased to be present with you this evening. I'm Zorica Patel, and I have quite an interesting, not such a life kind of journey, but educational journey, definitely, which started in my native country that does not exist anymore, which is ex-Yugoslavia, but I'm Serbian. And I did study a long time ago economics. And then when I came over here into the UK and settled, I then decided to go back to my first love in terms of subject areas, and that was psychology. So I completed a degree in psychology as well. And then I could not stop. As a little bit of a mature student, continued with occupational and organizational psychology on a master's level, and then coaching, and then it was ending up working at the university, and then it was a teaching qualification. And finally, it was a professional doctorate in occupational and organizational psychology. Both master's and doctoral studies happened at the University of East London. I am a senior lecturer at Westminster University for over 15 years, and employability director in the School of Organizations, Economy and Society. And at the same time, I have to say that I am a chartered occupational and I am a registered coaching psychology, but I also have a love for positive psychology. And I did create a module for second year students applying the tools of positive psychology for personal and professional development. And I will definitely be saying something on those lines this evening.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think it's a really interesting thing, the panel tonight. We've got kind of university and the academic side, and then we've got the much more museum kind of practical managing staff side. And I think that's going to be really interesting for the discussion. So Steve and Zori, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As I mentioned, the theme tonight, using Agile for an individual growth mindset. So we'll discuss how to maintain a growth mindset and try to explore some of the support mechanisms, both academically and sort of practitioner-wise, and how we can find ways to keep ourselves motivated. I think the first thing that I should say, though, to just kind of couch this discussion is what we actually mean by an agile growth mindset. An agile growth mindset is a mindset that empowers individuals to continually develop and grow, to view failure and problems as opportunities for learning, and to believe our own abilities aren't fixed. They evolve with effort. They enable us to grow over time. And of course, at the moment, the heritage sector is facing some of the most significant financial and operational challenges in its history. Most organizations have furloughed staff, they've frozen recruitment, they've made redundancies, been able to engage with volunteers. This means that through the whole of 2020 into 2021, personal growth has been a huge problem for staff. And it may be that the audience tonight, other people viewing this webinar a bit further on in the future via YouTube or whatever we put it on, will want to grab some kind of tools and things from it to help kind of the motivation to help develop and help to keep their mindset positive in such a difficult time. So I think that the first thing to do would be to get a little bit of a thought from both Zori and Steve on what having a growth mindset means to each of you. What does it mean to keep that kind of positive attitude in such difficult times? Can we start with Zori, please?
Yes, what I would say is that I think in the context of what I'm doing, which is basically teaching at the University of Westminster, as I said, in my role as a senior lecturer and employability director, I always try to actually encourage the growth mindset, whatever that concept might mean, and I will say in a minute what I think, with the students that I'm teaching. And I need to say that this learning process definitely goes both ways. They are learning from me about their different subject areas, but at the same time learning about themselves, and I'm learning from them as well. So it is a continuous process. So what I would actually say is that the key concept of this for me, which is this frame of mind, is actually the willingness to learn and to do so on a continuous level. That would then indicate a cognitive decision to be open-minded in order to grow or to acquire this either personal or professional development. That can depend on differences in personality, because some personality traits, such as openness to experience, are allowing these individuals to potentially have a better capability for the growth mindset. But of course, that can also be perceived on an attitudinal level, which is this willingness to learn. At the same time, we cannot neglect the role of emotions. They play also a crucial part here. So I would say, and I would suspect, that the growth mindset would involve in the change of the way how our mind is working in terms of thinking more flexibly, creatively, and not just thinking by feeling and acting at the same time. So more on a holistic level, not just one aspect of ourselves, but all cognition, emotions, and behavior. I would also add value systems and beliefs, but we can argue that. It is also interlinked with the psychological well-being. And what we mean by psychological well-being in a very simple term is the way how you live your life. This is definitely different to what we consider subjective well-being to be. In simplified terms, how you feel, the way how you feel. With psychological well-being, it is intertwined with this level of personal growth. It is intertwined with one's purpose in life, positive relationships that one should have, autonomy of making own decisions, self-acceptance, and so on. So in other words, it refers to the engagement with the existential challenges of life that one is having to deal with, which is coming from the humanistic psychology, this kind of path towards achieving self-actualization, fulfilling own potential, growing as a person, rather than just having a pleasure per se, which would be this psychological well-being. And I'm just going to use here, I'm reading here what Aristotle said, because very often we forget that many disciplines started with philosophy and philosophical levels, and then they developed. So Aristotle would say true happiness or positive well-being is found in the expression of virtue and doing what is worth doing. So realizing human potential is an ultimate goal. But the question here is, who is to realize this on an individual level, and how would an individual commence this path of personal growth mindset or developing own true self? And this is very individual. So I'm terribly sorry that I don't know if I actually answered your question, but what I was trying to say here is that when we say a mindset, that would imply only to be cognitive aspect of our being, but actually emotions, and this is really important aspect, play a huge role. And of course, then how we act in the process.
Yeah, and I think that kind of comes back to, as you're sort of talking about that holistic approach, it's something that people will be finding difficult right now because there's so much going on that they are finding difficult to get past maybe. and it's really affecting maybe people's emotions. You're not in the right headspace to actually try to I guess motivate yourself. Steve, it'd be good to hear from you a little bit about again what a growth mindset might mean to you, but also maybe how that kind of theoretical aspect marries to maybe what you've seen over the past year with your staff, and how you've been able to try and support them through, to motivate them to develop.
Yeah, I just really like what Zori said. I don't know if I'm quoting verbatim or just paraphrasing, but that it's about an attitude to learn continuously, and really appreciate what Zori said also about the emotional content. It's about the whole self. It's not just about a cognitive state. It's not just about the mind. It's about the whole person. I'm not an academic, but I read often just on my phone. I signed up ages ago to an app called Pocket, which is just an offline reading app, but they send me good content. And then very encouragingly, once a year, they send me an email saying that you've read the equivalent of 52 books this year from reading all these articles, some of which are short, some of which are long form, all sorts of things. And through Pocket, it's like, I guess it's my magazine. I read things about psychology, and I read things about leadership, and I read things about well-being, about philosophy. When I think of growth mindset just as a phrase, I think of the work of the American, I think she's a psychologist, again, not an expert in these things, a lady called Carol Dweck. And that's a name that I think is very strongly associated with that term. And it's my understanding of it obviously is not, on an academic level with Zori, but again, it's that attitude to learn continuously. The fact that intelligence, I think is possibly the right word here, is not fixed. It can be exercised and built like a muscle. And there's some really interesting stuff that I've read in not Carol Dweck's academic papers, but in more popular science books or articles that have referred to them, about how it's about the attitude to try rather than succeed. And it's really interesting. My son is 5. He's been at school for a year. Well, I say he's been at school. That's in the dining room, has been for a while. And his infant school in Buckinghamshire, they talk about a growth mindset. They are influenced by the work of Carol Dweck. And again, it's about trying. It's not about getting things right. It's about one of the things that my wife and I do. We praise him for his effort, his sincere effort to do things. It's not about whether he gets his letters the right way around or anything like that. So I think there's something in sincere effort that I associate with the concept, as I understand it, of a growth mindset. It was also really nice to have Zori talk about, ancient Greek philosophy. Again, not an academic, haven't studied it in detail, but I've picked up little Lego blocks of wisdom over the years. And this is a very well-known quote attributed to Socrates, which is that the unexamined life is not worth living. And it's something that I hold slightly pretentiously, but very strongly to. I believe it's important that we reflect on ourselves. And if we do, then it's not necessarily that everything is easier. In fact, far from it. It's often that it's richer. There's another phrase, I don't know which philosopher it's associated with, but it's, I may not be pronouncing this right, but amor fati, the love of fate. So the premise is, I think it's related to Stoic philosophy, the idea that you don't just accept what happens to you as an opportunity to learn grudgingly, you embrace it warmly. And you see everything as a chance to, Zori said this better, but become the fullness of the person you can be over the course of your life. Now, I do not practice amor fati very well. It's really, really hard when annoying things happen to go, yes, but there is something about, I think, that I've learned over the years that I've been a director of an independent museum, that what I like about it is the fact that because I'm responsible for not just the strategic direction of the organization, the finances, but the morale, the emotional state of the museum. I set a tone. I set it upwards to my board, I set it downwards to the staff. I'm the pinch point in the hourglass. And I find that knowing that responsibility is mine, there's nobody to pass it to, helps me work through my own initial emotional reaction to difficult situations. I haven't got time to be in a funk about something. I've got to get beyond it, and I've got to see what we can do about it. And I think one of the ways that I've come to think of leadership is that leadership is often the art of getting stuff done when you don't actually know how to do it, and you carry on and get something worthwhile done anyway over time. And of course, in order to do that, you learn as you go. And so I didn't know how to be the director of an independent museum before I became one. I had been around enough blocks in my previous career to have a clue and to have a network of people that if I didn't know how to do stuff, I could get somebody on the phone and say, more broadly, of course, our sector is extremely collaborative and good at sharing information and knowledge, whether that's on the gem list, whether it's at an event like this, which is great. So I think I just wanted to say one other thing, because again, I kind of collect these little tidbits from writers and philosophers throughout the ages. I keep what I think of as a modern version of a 18th century commonplace book in a note on my phone. If I find a quote that really resonates with me, I just keep a copy of it and look back at it from time to time. And there's one that I never get these 100% right, but Alain de Botton, the contemporary philosopher, has said something like, if we're not, occasionally deeply embarrassed by who we are, we're not learning and growing as people. And again, holding a thought like that in my mind is really valuable. If I feel like I've gone through an experience, I'm going through an experience and I'm not handling it well, remembering a concept like that can be a real comfort that I've got to go through a difficult period. So to come back to and just finish my point on, your direct question, Joe, about practically how did it work? In the first lockdown, I was as stressed as anyone. I was kicking myself that I didn't better anticipate the COVID crisis. I saw it and it was a problem in China. That's how I read it. We reacted pretty quickly when it all, gripped the country in March 2020 at the museum, and we shut ourselves down pretty quickly. But I felt that I had not been as smart as I could have been. But I had to get beyond that because that was done now. And successively through the first lockdown, that's how I felt, trying to absorb all the information that was coming at me, trying to then synthesize that and share it back to the staff and the board so they felt hopefully less anxious was really important. And part of doing that was actually saying, well, I don't really know what this means, but this is what I think it might mean. So I wasn't pretending to be more knowledgeable than I was. On a very practical basis, there was a really eye-opening moment for me when the furlough scheme was first announced and I was trying to understand the details of it. And I started looking on HR websites and doing Google searches and stuff. And what I realized was that every damn website that was talking about it had almost nothing to say because the information just wasn't there yet. And yet loads of people had troubled to put up what little they could on an HR website, on an advisory website, and it was the same damn content everywhere. And once I realized that that's all people were doing, they were as desperate and as uncertain as I was. In a weird way, that was a big source of comfort. And one of the things I had to learn and did learn in the first lockdown was to calm down, slow down, not attend too many webinars. I attended the right ones, but not worry too much about the ones that I didn't. And just do my best and keep going.
I think I'll just go back to something you said, which chimes quite nicely, almost like a backbone for what we were talking about. That idea that your attitude can be built like a muscle. You can flex it, you can grow it. And I think some of the things you sort of touched on there about that attitude of trying, make sure you're either praising others or maybe seeking out praise or praising yourself for the effort you're putting in, and the kind of opening up yourself to learn as you go. I think they're really important, very practical tools. Zori, is there any sort of methods and tools that you're working with students which could really help to build, as I say, a muscle, your attitude like a muscle?
Well, during my teaching of applying the tools of positive psychology to personal and professional development, one of the sessions is about positive well-being. And within this session, I definitely mentioned two very important models of Barbara Fredrickson. First of all, it's to do with the mindset of positivity. It is a seemingly simple model. Be open, be open. Positive emotions, if you have more of positive emotions, they're opening the pathways to new ways of thinking and behavior to emerge, and meeting and engaging with new people, different individuals. Be appreciative. And I think during pandemic, this really came across extremely strongly. So we accept the fleeting nature of positive emotions and we appreciate them in the process, because we definitely know that through research that there is a positivity that fades, a negativity ratio to positivity is 3:1. We dwell too much more about negative aspects of life than positive. So to use some of the strategies to amplify our positive emotions because they're fleeting, and then to somehow also bring more and more sense of appreciation to what we have, which is a gratitude. And I think that pandemic really brought that. Third aspect of this mindset of positivity, which are not my ideas, but as I said, Frederickson, 2009, is be curious. So engaging wholeheartedly with experiences and displaying this inquiring mind all the time in all moments of life. Be kind. Again, this came across as a very important aspect, because the most fruitful avenues for cultivating positive emotions may be actually helping others to find a positive meaning in their daily experiences, and this kindness that we saw and some kind of cohesiveness in the situation that we found ourselves, however negative it was, brought that more kind of profoundly. And be real, be authentic, identify what you love doing and try to do it despite the circumstances that you find yourself in. And then another model that I also use from the same author and talk about, the model is called the Broaden and Build theory of positive emotions. So the Broaden aspect, so broadening thought and behavior repertoire is more temporary, but these positive emotions are helping us see things in a wider perspective and help us resolve some issues, some problems that we might be facing. When we are burdened with negative emotions such as anger, depression, anxiety, we kind of narrow our repertoire of thinking and behaving. The positive emotions really help. And that's where this high level of flexibility, creativity, productivity, and sometimes I call that a lateral thinking as well, thinking on your feet. And as Steve rightly pointed out, if we had all answers to every situation that we find ourselves in, well, we wouldn't need a growth mindset, but we actually learn from trying, failing, moving on, continuing. We learn from our experiences, and this is how we build the resources. That's why this Broaden and Build theory of positive emotions come to play. And when we talk about resources, I would definitely then talk to students and now to the audience here about a concept of psychological capital. We very often talk about other types of capital, financial and this and that, but not psychological capital. And it's made up of 4 very important aspects. And this is hope, optimism, resilience, and self-efficacy or self-confidence. Now, the hope in itself as one aspect was very important, and it is still important because we will come out from the pandemic, but individuals and organizations will find themselves facing in future some different issues. And how do they go about these issues if they don't have this aspect of psychological capital, which in other words is about willpower and way to resolve the situations, whatever they might be. And then optimism, it involves a positive reframing about the negative situations. Now, resilience, I think, is the concept that is very popular, very well known, a more hot topic. And rather than hope and optimism, how do we bounce back? How do we face the, reality when situations go wrong, stress, catastrophe, whatever that might be? And then, of course, self-efficacy. self-confidence, which is crucially important, and they are actually crippling individuals in the situations that are not like situations that we find ourselves at this moment in time, but in normal everyday situations. So these building up all of these elements of psychological capital and emphasis on that is crucially important.
And I think, I mean, I think I've learned to sort of appreciate the smallest things that I've tried to do, because as you both kind of touched on, because it's been so difficult, you do lose almost that self-confidence. You do lose that sort of ability to almost self-reflect on the good things you're doing. You just kind of, you know, oh, I'm just doing those, you know. I mean, everyone here tonight, for instance, has come along to, you know, spend an hour listening to, you know, high quality speakers just to hear how they could self-improve. Even just like turning up for an hour tonight is a really positive step, in my opinion. And I think those are the sort of things that you don't reflect on as, oh, I've done this, you know. But in reality, you're probably doing this all the time, you know, as Steve sort of said, just reading a little bit every day about inspirational quotes motivates you, you know. And I think those little things is something I have really tried to, I guess, learn to appreciate that I've been doing. I just want to quickly remind everyone to add some questions into the chat if you've got them, before we move on to the Q&A in about sort of 10 minutes. Before we do, there's a very good question on there, which I would have sort of touched on the topic of due to the conversation we've just had, but I'm going to park that and just sort of ask you to maybe spend a few minutes each talking about what kind of practical advice you might give to museum professionals, kind of with the last year in mind. What kind of things, what kind of tools, what kind of, you know, practical mechanisms could people put into place to really boost their growth mindset? Steve, how would you sort of say it was your staff, you know, try to push them to really grow as we come out of the pandemic?
Well, I mentioned in my intro that we had a flood incident in 2018, and the museum was closed for 5 months. And most of the staff that are still at the museum were there 2 years ago, so they experienced that that situation together. And we haven't laboured the point, but I think that having gone through that big disruption has been helpful for the group facing this. And that's not down to me. That's just circumstance. But one of the things that I want to pick up on some of Zori's points about, you know, positive language and reframing. When that flood happened, and you know, board members would say, "Oh, it's a disaster," or whatever. I was like, "No, it's not. It'd be a disaster if we didn't have insurance. We've got insurance. It's going to be annoying. It really was dealing with the insurance company. They were great, but you know, loss adjusters and contractors that are imposed upon you. But we got through it, and deliberately making sure that we didn't call it a crisis or a disaster. Now, I haven't been quite that militant because COVID's another few degrees of scale worse. It's global. You know, it's huge. So I may have referred to it as a crisis sometimes, but not overly so. And so I think that framing is really, really important. And talking about, you know, picking your point up, Joe, about, you know, the little things that you can do. Well, in the first lockdown, you know, we had kids at home trying to find time in normal office hours. It all went on phone calls with my direct reports. And then, you know, there was just about enough time to produce written reports and updates for people is still the most efficient way of sharing information across a large group of people. And if all I managed to achieve in a working day of a few hours interspersed with lots of hardcore parenting was to speak to my direct reports and see how they were doing, that was something. So I think communication is key, and speaking in positive terms, and as Zori said, being kind is so important, that positive language. And being appreciative. You know, we were not, as a museum, in that rotten a state financially at the start of the crisis because we had been building up our reserves painfully over several years to support an intended capital project, which then suddenly got thrown into pause because the National Lottery Heritage Fund closed its major capital grant programs. We hadn't been funded. We were trying to get funded. But we had, therefore, a reasonably large dollop of cash in the bank that we had intended to use on our future, and we had to, as it were, spend our college fund to survive in the present. It meant we weren't eligible for the very early emergency funds. But then we had to stop and say, well, okay, that's because we're actually not yet in an terrible financial crisis. We are an independent museum, but we get supported very generously with donations to the Roald Dahl Story Company, the copyright holders for Roald Dahl's works. They don't pay for everything by any means. We're, you know, 70% of our turnover needs to be generated through earned income. And just to give you some chilling stats, in the financial year 2020-21, we estimate we'll have made less than 6% of our normal levels of earned income and seen less than 3% of our normal visitors. So it's pretty stark. But we have had furlough money. You know, we furloughed probably 98% of staff for many months. We've had support from the Roald Dahl Story Company, as you know, they've been solid for us. We did get a Cultural Recovery Fund grant. We've been all right, and saying we're all right and recognizing that point, and even just acknowledging that the future, even though it feels more uncertain under COVID, is always in fact uncertain. The existence of the COVID crisis proves it. It's like, we didn't see this coming. Some people did, but most people didn't. So being grateful is, I think, really, really important, and being kind to each other. I wanted to make a very practical point, really. So because of our relatively okay financial situation, you know, raiding from our future fund to do okay in the present, when we furloughed people, we decided that, because we don't pay a lot of money, we're a museum, of course, we decided to top up everybody's furlough pay from 80% to 100%. And we did that. I put that to the board because it's a human thing to do. I did it because I didn't want to stress people out more. It turned out that it had a really practical benefit. When they shifted the scheme and created flexible furlough, we could bring a few people back part-time to start preparing to reopen with what was for us a completely new way of visitor operation, which was 100% guided visits. Really, really amazing visitor experience, absolutely shockingly low capacity, but it gave us a focus. So it was a really worthwhile thing to do because it gave the team a job to do. Not all of them all at the same time, and the fact that we were paying 100% pay if you were on furlough or not meant that whether you were selected for flexible furlough or not was less contentious. Nobody felt financially worse off. Now, I can't speak for my staff, but I haven't had the impression that morale has been too bad. I mean, there's been the general anxiety that everybody on the planet has experienced through COVID, but I think because we made some good, generous, kind decisions, they've actually had a really practical managerial benefit to me. There's been a lot less contentiousness, or at least that I'm aware of, which has been really, really good. And as I say, finding things for the staff to do and being open in a new way has been really good. And just before Christmas, we only opened like in midway through September to the end of October. There was a November lockdown. Then we opened a bit in December, and then we had like the tiering into tier 3 and tier 4, and then the lockdown that we're still in. So we didn't operate for very long with guided visits, and the visitor capacity was less than 15% of normal levels. Even less during October half term. Even though we sold out our tours, we saw 8% of the kind of numbers we would normally see. And so it wasn't much time, but it was something to do, to develop, to figure out. We felt really confident in it as a COVID secure method of operation because we kept one family in one space of the museum at any given time. And that we kind of made a virtue of being a small compact site. We had our annual Visit England VAQAS, Visitor Attraction Quality Assurance Scheme assessment in December, and we got a 91% score, which means that we've been nominated for a National Gold Award. And we don't know if we'll get one. It doesn't really matter. What's really great is that somebody came in and told us that we were doing a really great job, and we knew it. It's still nice for somebody else to tell you, and it's their job to assess these things. So it's all been about celebrating what has been possible. That, I think, has been a really key part of it. It's about being kind to each other. I wanted to just make a broader point about that, actually, picking up something that Zori said about emotional capital. That I think this is a bit too trite, but I try and adopt an approach with my staff, with myself, that there isn't really such a thing as a mistake. There's just things that happen. And they can become mistakes by the way that you treat them. So if you deny that they happened, if you pretend that things are other than they are, if you spend too long trying to focus on blame and not what you do about it, then that turns a thing, an incident, into a mistake. Now, of course, sometimes people do stuff or don't do stuff that is really, really frustrating. I've managed people where that has happened. But over the years as a manager, I've got better at moving beyond my irritation quickly, internally. I'm not saying I don't show any of it, but it's about trying to move forward. And one of the key reasons that I do that is that I heard about this concept years ago, the emotional bank account, through the work of Stephen Covey, who produced a sort of a self-help guide called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which I've read and been trained in and found, quite memorable as a form of codified common sense. And the idea of the emotional bank account is that the ratio that Covey talks about is that you need to have 7 good deeds to outdo 1 bad deed. So it's 7 credits to 1 debit. So basically, if I blow my top at my staff, it takes me 7 times as long to recover that position in our relationship. So the smart thing to do is not blow my top at my staff, because I haven't got the time or the energy to do that 7. Why would I make work for myself trying to recover that relationship? What's better is to pay attention to it in every moment. So I think in terms of a practical technique, I do it hopefully because I'm a nice guy, but because I follow that Socratean doctrine of, the unexamined life is not worth living, and I'm thinking about what I'm doing as I'm doing it, there's a really, you can call it cynical if you like, it's a very pragmatic approach to getting on with people, because I'm a limited person. I'm a simple, I'm not special, and I haven't got the energy to make life harder for myself. So if I can practice, being a certain way that actually helps life keep moving forward, keeps the positive flow, I'm not doing it purely out of goodness. I'm doing it out of a form of selfishness. But whatever works, right?
I think so. And I think the framing that you sort of talk about is so important, and kind of it's a great way to look at it, that like we can't offer what we usually would have because of this. It means we won't hit these targets and so on and so forth. But instead, we've done one of the best visitor experiences we'll ever do. And it's, flipping that sort of way you look at it is a really important way, I think, to self-motivate. I need to move on to the Q&A now, because we've got some great questions. And I mean, what's been really interesting, just before I do, to note is that this is probably the first LMG webinar we've done that's going to come with a reading list. There's so many kind of different philosophies you've both sort of talked through, and great things. And my colleague May's been putting quite a few of them in the chat. So if there's some really interesting things that stuck out from what Zori and Steve have referenced, have a look in the chat. There's some great links in there that you can kind of follow up on for some of that reading. So one of the things Steve just sort of touched on was about kind of essentially not failing and thinking it's failing, that kind of a positive attitude towards trying something. And if it fails, it fails. That's not such a problem. It's an opportunity. And that links very nicely to a question we've had from the audience about reflecting on moving to embody not having to get it right in a sector that can be really risk averse. And how do we actually move the sector towards, taking risks and understanding that it's not a problem so much to fail. Is there something you'd like to sort of weigh in with that on, Zori, to sort of how can you say it's fine to get things wrong, and then get the rest of the sector to really think about that? And thanks to Louise for the question, by the way.
First of all, yes, thank you, Joe. First of all, I want to compliment Steve for being honest about pragmatism and selfishness. So I'm just going to say something about what I would call a pragmatic approach to resilience, accepting the reality, whatever it is, and then still keeping a deep belief that life and whatever you experience is still extremely meaningful, because we learn from positive and negative experiences, and sometimes more from negative than positive. And these kind of situations where we are not just now, but continuously facing what we call VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. How do we deal with all that in a flexible manner? Well, we actually have to improvise. we have to start learning, and that's not very good for personality traits of perfectionism, when you have plenty of time potentially to do the best job possible. But especially what Steve was mentioning earlier is doing things that you actually don't know what you're doing. You have to learn on your feet. So this improvisation will also, in a creative way, bring us to new ways of learning. And capacity to turn negative situations into opportunities for learning and for development. And there is something also from not just pragmatic point of view, but kind of some cognitive styles that could apply, and this is not like a rocket science. How do we deal with setbacks? Do we say this only happens to me, to museum personnel, to people working in other organizations, or bad things can and do happen, and these sort of things happen to anyone? So we are in the same boat, as Steve would say earlier. Or are we going to say this kind of thing always happened to me? Or this is one-off, just a setback, move on. Or I'm completely useless, this imposter syndrome, I'm making mistake, I'm not worth it. Or it is disappointing, but it does not happen all the time. So it is pragmatic approach, but also change in our cognitive approach to the ways how we deal with setbacks, omissions, errors, our expectations that we don't fulfill, or others' expectations, and so on.
And Steve, how do you take that and sort of try to sell that within the sector? That kind of attitude. How do you convince people that it's fine to, not be risk averse?
Well, I don't think that this is to do with convincing. I think that this has to become a way of thinking and accepting as something that needs to happen. For example, I love going to the museums, but why are museums not coming to me? What about thinking about, someone mentioned on the cloud, need for digitalization. I don't know what happened with majority of the museums that you have. I did not follow that, but did anyone made some digital films in terms of, here you are, this is our museum, you can't come to us, but we come to you, or something like that, finding ways to raise the funds, finding different ways of working?
I think one of the things that I imagine the Louise is sort of suggesting is that those ideas are really good, and a lot of museums have done them. My museum's done them. But when you then throw in things like budgets, or you might have really risk-averse managers, there's a certain element that you need to convince them that it's fine to take a risk. Steve, is that something you've sort of had that sort of hands-on experience with? Is that something you've had to sell? Have you had people sell things to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to be too pedantic, but I wouldn't frame the idea of being comfortable with risk as a notion that we don't have to get it right. I think that's rubbish. I think actually we should really be trying to get things as right as possible all the time. What I think we need to do is give ourselves a break if there are twists and turns and hiccups and bends on the road, and see those as a learning opportunity. So I'll give you a very recent personal example for me. I worked really late, pretty much every night last week, pulling together like a really dense finance committee paper that I needed to present to the finance committee on Monday. And there was some clarity in it. It wasn't a terrible paper. I realized in the course of the finance committee meeting that I hadn't, in the paper, managed to get to the really, really simple ask of just how much spend I needed the finance committee to recommend the board was okay to invest in our road to recovery. I just hadn't extracted the actual figure and said, right, this is actually what I need right now. I'd gone for the big picture of this is what I think we might need to spend overall, but I hadn't boiled it down to the key decision and what I needed to do right now. So I am kicking myself a little bit for that, but I don't spend too long over it, because what I had done in producing the big long paper was I had managed to get my thoughts sufficiently in order that I was able to make that request on the fly in the meeting. When the committee said, well, how much do you actually need? I was like, you're right, it's not in the paper. I need this much right now. And they went, yeah, that's fine. So what was good about it was that, you know, I hadn't done it perfectly, but I got to where I needed to get to. And so what I did was I was kind to myself for the work and the effort that I'd done under difficult circumstances, that it had got me as far as it needed to. It hadn't got me all the way. I hadn't done it 100% perfectly, but I kept going towards where I was trying to get to. And when I say that we should try and get things right, it's about having a sense of purpose, it's trying to have a sense of our goals. I think there are a lot of projects that I've seen throughout my career at other museums where people just kind of barrel on and they're bloody clueless. They didn't really have a good enough plan. They didn't stop and think about it. They didn't live an examined life. They just kind of went hell for leather. That's a terrible way to approach work. It doesn't sit right with me at all. So it's more about being able to be honest and saying, right, that was good enough, that worked. If the finance committee for me on Monday had gone differently and I had arrived and I just hadn't been clear enough, then I'd have had to own that, and I'd have had to say, yeah, sorry, no, I don't have all the information. I need to do better at that. Because that's what I mean when I said earlier about there's no such thing as a mistake. I mean, there are things that are mistakes, but what I try and do is go, okay, well, I'm not going to waste time worrying about whether it was or it wasn't. If it didn't work, what I need to move super quickly towards is what's the thing that's going to work better. Mm-hmm. So we should always be trying to get things right, and we should then be trying to get them even more right, and then even more right again. One of the concepts that I used with my staff in my first sort of couple of years at the museum, because it was a fairly high-performing museum on lots of levels, I felt there was lots of room for improvement, but it wasn't like there was a big crisis or a big issue that needed solving. So I took that concept that you may have heard of from elite sport, the idea of marginal gains, that you're not going to find room for a 20% improvement in somebody who's already performing at a really high level, but you might find 20 areas where you can make a 1% improvement. And I think that's often a really good way to look at things, because it's also less scary for staff. You're not dismissing all the things that they're doing that are okay or even really good. What you're saying is, great, that's our foundation. What can we put on top of that? And what we put on top of that doesn't have to be terrifying, doesn't have to be everything. It can just be a tiny little thing that moves us forward. We had an issue.
And I think one thing just to add on to that, from my own perspective, is kind of having that plan is really important, because it helps you to target exactly where, particularly if you're pitching something to decision makers, those kind of marginal gains might happen. Sorry. I used to work at the Natural History Museum a year or so ago, and obviously as a huge sort of national institution with 1,000 people working at it, it's a very slow moving thing. There's a lot of inherent risk there, and actually getting ideas that, particularly if they're either new or controversial maybe through, is a really, really difficult thing. And the thing I found the most success is to put it in the words of the people that were going to strike the decision, and sort of say, you know, this will make you X money, and it will, you know, make you look really good at this community that you're trying to target. And so, and it's not so much, you know, it's that's the plan, you know, it's not so much what can you do, it's how can you convince someone else and make them positive about something. And I think that's a really sort of important thing to keep in mind, is that, you know, your own mindset is very important to focus on to get things, you know, moving along, but you need to motivate people along with you and take them on that journey.
There's a concept from improvisational comedy, which people may be familiar with, which is the notion of yes and. So instead of saying no but, which I think we all have a tendency towards, I hold my hand up, I definitely, you know, do that. But I try and pay more attention to it. I try and do it less often. And if you, another way of looking at marginal gains is you say, yes, we're doing all these things, and so you're building, you're not breaking down, you're building. Sometimes it's necessary to break things apart and rebuild, but if you can build on things, if you can build on things that you've said before. So one of the things that we have at the museum is we have a really clear statement of purpose for the organization. We know what our goal is as a charity. We were founded as an educational charity, which I think is relatively unusual in the independent museum sector because we're a relatively young one. We weren't founded to look after the old stuff, and then education's been kind of the thing that we feel that we ought to do. we would deliberately, hard baked into our founding objectives as a charity, to educate. And therefore the museum, the collection, the heritage is just the mechanism by which we educate. So our purpose is clear, and we have a statement of purpose that we developed in my sort of first year at the museum that is our everyday definition of those charitable objectives. And what's been really useful, just to pick up on something that Zori said, is that we are doing something digital, but we're just doing it really slowly. So we recognized in the first lockdown that this, being on Zoom, technology has been around for a while. The habit to use it has not been so prevalent. It's certainly prevalent now, right? So we recognized that what we already knew from our schools program was that people really value the facilitation by our staff. So if we could put our educators on Zoom, that would work. And that would allow a museum, small museum, but with a big name, to actually achieve its potential as a charity and start reaching schools that, you know, read and study and enjoy Roald Dahl's works around the country, potentially around the world, that couldn't come to us because either our school program was full, was at capacity, or just geography was in the way. You know, people only travel about 90 minutes maximum to come to the museum. And we've been working on that ever since. Now, we didn't do a rapid pivot to digital. It is taking us a long time because we're actually trying to design something for the long term. We're actually trying to design something for when kids are back in school and they're in their classroom together looking at our educator on a smartboard. And then our educator is able to cut to loads of really great pre-recorded content to show off the museum. So we're trying to make it as close to the experience of coming to the museum and having a shared cultural experience as a class as we can through the medium of video calls. And it's taken a long time. But what's brilliant is our statement of purpose says that everybody who experiences the Roald Dahl Museum can understand how the work of Roald Dahl can be a key to unlock the stories we all have inside. So when we wrote that statement of purpose 5 years ago, we chose the word experience rather than visits. So what we're doing by taking our schools program online, which we hope to launch next term, is totally congruent with our statement of purpose. We didn't know we were going to do this, but on some level, the way that we phrased our statement of purpose was anticipating opportunities like this without knowing what they would be. And
I think
yeah,
that's a really
I have a little moment of pride that I feel that we got that right. It doesn't really matter if our statement of purpose said visits and we're doing this. That's not a problem, but it's still.
I'm sorry, Steve. I just need to jump in because I will say it's a really good thought to end on, is that kind of seeing opportunities, but we do need to end because it's 8:30 and we're about to get kicked out of the Zoom. So thank you so much to Zori and Steve for your thoughts tonight. Thank you so much for taking part. Hopefully everyone in the audience has enjoyed this. Our next event is on fostering collaborative practice on the 11th of March with Etty and Joseph from Hackney Archives and Francis Jeans from the Jewish Museum. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you again to Zori and Steve, and to May and Cheryl from the London Museums Group team for running tech support, and have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.